Tonight, we drift into the Arctic silence of 1845, a realm of endless white, snapping ice, and a sun that refuses to rise. Somewhere in that frozen void, two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, lie trapped, their timbers creaking like the sighs of trapped men. Inside, 130 sailors vanish without a trace. No signal, no struggle, just journals smeared with frost, bones gnawed by comrades, and messages carved in snow. All well, God forgive me. Britain called them heroes. The Arctic called them gone. And nearly 2 centuries later, the ice still keeps its secrets. The journal entry is scratched in a nearly illegible hand, the ink smeared by frostbite or perhaps trembling fingers. January 12th, the ice takes all. The men, one by one, gone. I do not know how long we will last. God forgive me. Just those few lines, penned in the unforgiving grip of the Arctic, yet heavy enough to hang over centuries like a frozen noose. Imagine staring at that page, thinking, these were men of iron, explorers armed with maps, charts, and a government's blind confidence, and now they are whispers trapped in ice. No screams, no struggle, just the uncanny silence of snow swallowing every life aboard the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. And yet, this isn't fiction. Somewhere in the northern reaches of the world, those ships drifted into darkness, swallowed by the Arctic wasteland. We have fragments, a boot with foot still in it, half buried in snow, a skeleton frozen in position, jaw slack with horror, and scattered relics, buttons, pipes, knives, reminders that humans once existed here, dreaming of discovery, unaware they were stepping into a mausoleum they could never escape. You feel it immediately, don't you? That weird chill of impossibility. How could a crew of 130 men vanish almost entirely without a trace in 1845, leaving behind nothing but cryptic scraps of diaries, and the skeletal remains that later explorers would stumble upon? And those scraps, they're not tidy. They are chaotic, almost desperate. One captain writes of a darkness that is not night. Another laments rations and men succumbing to madness, and still others note inexplicable deaths. Flesh rotting before the body succumbs. The thing that claws at you isn't just death. It's the way death happened, not with elegance or ceremony, but with absurd, biting cruelty. Frozen bodies, cannibalized comrades, Arctic storms laughing as they tore men from decks and dragged them across sheets of jagged ice. You can almost hear the ice cracking, snapping like a whip, mocking every plan made in a warm London drawing room months before. By the time the first search parties reached the region, Erebus and Terror were already phantoms. Investigators would find graves with no names, bones picked clean or gnawed, and messages carved into sledging notes. All well, proceeding south, lies surely, because what was left behind told another story entirely. And somehow, against all odds, fragments of these men's personal belongings survived, like ghosts insisting that the world never forget. Think about it. A government expedition vanishes, and the only evidence is a dozen half-decayed journals and the occasional ice-entombed artifact. And yet, we spent decades piecing together their final weeks, hypotheses, forensic analysis, the occasional fragment of clothing preserved in permafrost. Every clue is a whisper of terror. Every diary a scream frozen midair. It's the sort of story that makes you question, how did a crew trained, experienced, equipped, and confident succumb so utterly to an Arctic apocalypse? What unseen force, nature, misjudgment, or something else guided them into oblivion? This is not simply a tale of men lost at sea. This is a haunting of ambition, a frozen theater of human frailty, and a reminder that the earth itself can mock even the bravest, most organized plans. When you turn those brittle pages, you're staring not only into history, but into the mindless void that consumed the Franklin expedition. And it is watching back. The year was 1845, and Britain was draped in pride, industrial smoke, and the intoxicating belief that empire was endless. Queen Victoria sat upon her throne as the world's eyes turned toward the poles, not just for maps or trade routes, but for the kind of glory that only total conquest and discovery could deliver. Arctic exploration had become a theater of national vanity, and Franklin's expedition was the crown jewel of ambition. These weren't wandering sailors. They were state-sponsored warriors against ice, frost, and nothingness itself. Imagine London then. Cobblestone streets slick with rain, gas lamps flickering against the fog, newspapers filled with speculation about what lay beyond the maps. There was an almost romantic obsession with the unknown, the kind that would later feel bitterly ironic. The Franklin expedition promised to chart the Northwest Passage, a shortcut to the Pacific that had eluded centuries of explorers. It wasn't just a voyage. It was a wager against the universe, an assertion that human ingenuity could outsmart centuries of Arctic cruelty. The Arctic itself, vast, silent, white, and unfeeling, was almost a character. Ice fields stretching endlessly, shifting with a cruel caprice. Jagged bergs hiding whirlpools beneath, winter darkness lasting months, swallowing sound and sanity alike. The polar bears weren't just predators. They were sentinels of the void, the first hints that this land obeyed no law except survival. For men used to English fog and predictable bite of winter winds, this was an entirely alien stage. And yet, there was a human touch in every preparation. The ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were state-of-the-art, steam-powered, fortified, stocked with tinned food, a novelty then, and manned by seasoned officers and sailors. Each man believed genuinely that they could master this frozen world. They believed in discipline, in charts, in navigation. They believed in the British crown. They believed in themselves. There was hubris woven into every rope, every barrel of preserved meat, every carefully penned diary. And that hubris, when matched with the Arctic's merciless indifference, would become a lethal joke. The men were entering a theater with no audience, a stage with no exit, where mistakes were fatal and survival was a mathematical improbability. Outside, the ice shifted silently. The aurora flared green and pink across the sky, indifferent to planning or prayer. In short, the world they entered was beautiful, yes, but also a cage whose bars were frost, wind, and an inexorable understanding that nature does not negotiate. By the time Franklin and his officers departed, they were celebrated, feted, and imagined as legends in the making. Every journal, map, and ship manifest was a promise that the expedition would return with stories of triumph. And yet, history has a way of twisting promises into nightmares. Within weeks, that distant, icy horizon began its quiet, relentless consumption. The maps they hoped to fill became grave markers, the auroras a mocking applause, and the snow, relentless, infinite white, was already erasing their existence before anyone could record it. Sir John Franklin himself. Picture him. A man weathered, yet somehow still full of quiet authority, with eyes that hinted at the frost he would eventually face not only on the ice but inside himself. He had spent decades commanding ships, navigating seas where compass needles spun like drunk gamblers, and surviving storms that made lesser men weep. Franklin was meticulous, methodical, and, here's the thing, deeply human in ways that would haunt the expedition story. He was not invincible. He was stubborn, sometimes infuriatingly so, a man who would rather march straight into disaster than admit the Arctic had him beaten. The crew itself reads like a catalog of ambition and fate. Officers polished to a shine on parade decks, seasoned sailors who had braved storms and disease, young midshipmen dreaming of medals and fame. Each man carried a private story, letters tucked into pockets, sketches of loved ones, prayers whispered into the Arctic wind, bottles of whiskey stashed for courage. They were not blank slates. They were human beings with fears, obsessions, and weaknesses. One man had a fondness for poetry, another for experiments with ice-melting techniques. One secretly hoarded chocolate rations, and all of them carried the weight of knowing failure was not an option. And then there were the ships. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were marvels of technology, the closest thing Victorian England had to a fortress at sea. Steam engines, reinforced hulls, insulated cabins, every cannon in place, It was a floating promise that science could tame nature. But here's the delicious irony. Those ships meant to defy the elements would become tombs. The metal would creak, the steam engines fail, the hulls would crack under ice, and men would realize that no human invention could negotiate with the Arctic's patient, ancient fury. You begin to see the tragic poetry here. Franklin, the cautious adventurer, the man whose reputation demanded caution, was leading men into a world that had already decided their fate. The crew, the brave, the hopeful, the human, was marching toward an annihilation that no courage or skill could prevent. And yet they believed. They believed in orders, in maps, in each other, in the idea that Britain could conquer even the poles. What's terrifying, when you think about it, is just how relatable all of them are. Ambitious, proud, overconfident, desperate to prove themselves. They were us almost in another time and place, except they were trapped on a frozen stage with no audience, where every misstep was permanent, every delay deadly. And Franklin himself, he becomes almost a tragic figure in the Greek sense, doomed not because of incompetence, but because the world he faced was indifferent, infinite, and absurdly patient. Even before the ice closed in, even before the first men began disappearing, you can feel the tension in these human elements. They are more than victims. They are mirror images of ambition, arrogance, and fragile hope. And the deeper you look, the more you realize that the real subject of this story isn't just Franklin or his crew. It is the terrible, beautiful inevitability of the Arctic itself, dragging men toward annihilation with the patience of a god who's bored, amused, and entirely unconcerned with human pride. The first disturbance isn't a scream. It isn't a storm or a sudden explosion. It's subtle. It's the quiet that settles over a man when the cold seeps deeper than his bones. Franklin's journals record nothing dramatic at first, just routine, just observations, but buried between the lines is dread, almost microscopic, like a virus of terror infecting every entry. Rations were sufficient, spirits high, the engines functional, and then the ice began to tighten its invisible grip. Ships immobilized in the Arctic are not ships anymore. They are coffins quietly sinking an illusion of safety. Erebus and Terror became frozen into an expanse that refused movement. Weeks turned into months. The sun disappeared for stretches of darkness, so long that men began to lose track of day and night. The way a nightmare folds time into itself. You can almost hear the soft panic in their notes. We will be here some time yet. Provisions hold. Morale steady, though a sense of unease spreads. And then the deaths began. Not suddenly, not explosively, but one by one. Illness, scurvy, hypothermia, accidents. But always a nagging, ineffable sense that it wasn't just the Arctic killing them. Men were found slumped in cabins, eyes staring blankly at walls, their skin a waxen testament to cold and despair. Some wrote frantic letters never sent, describing hallucinations, shadows moving in corners, whispers from the ice. These first disturbances were almost imperceptible in the grand timeline of the expedition, but in hindsight, they are like the first notes of a symphony of horror that will crescendo into total catastrophe. The journals also hint at interpersonal collapse. Men who were once comrades began arguing over trivialities, ration allocations, sledging orders, even a boot left on the wrong deck. Franklin's own handwriting grew shakier, more desperate. Instructions repeated themselves. Words seemed to claw at the page, as though the Arctic had invaded the pen itself, a malign force eroding discipline and logic. There's even mention of men wandering alone onto the ice for hours, returning with frostbitten faces, their eyes glazed with strange recognition, as if they had glimpsed something impossible and terrible and brought it back with them. And yet, from the outside, the world saw only two ships frozen in a desolate polar wasteland. No reports, no frantic telegrams, no headlines. Britain waited for news, confident in Franklin's experience, certain that men of such training could endure. Only later, when search parties ventured north and found skeletons half buried in snow, with evidence of cannibalism etched into their bones, did the true horror begin to emerge. This is a kind of disturbance that doesn't just kill, it unravels. It is psychological, moral, physical, all at once. You can trace the spiral from that first crack of morale to the last desperate, starving survivor trudging over ice, wondering if death is a mercy or a release, if rescue is even possible, or they've already passed into a world that will never notice their absence. The Arctic didn't just stop the expedition, it rewrote it, turning men of action into whispers, into shadows, into artifacts preserved for decades so the rest of humanity could gape in disbelief. And here's where it starts to get maddening, frustrating in a way that makes your head spin with unanswered questions. The Franklin expedition didn't just vanish. No, that would be too simple. It became a riddle wrapped in ice, and every subsequent clue only deepened the horror. First, there were the search parties. Men sent to find Franklin, only to stumble upon eerie relics. Boots with toes gnawed away, empty cabins buried under snow, journals torn and water-stained, maps half-eaten by rats or rot. Every piece implied a story, but none of them told it fully. Some clues are almost comic in their absurdity, if not from tragedy. A note claiming, all well, found in a cairn months later, when it was clear the crew was anything but. And then there's the skeletons, men lying in unnatural positions as though frozen mid-gesture, some showing clear signs of cannibalism. Yes, cannibalism. Anthropologists decades later would analyze cut marks on bones and conclude, in the end, survival had turned moral codes upside down. And yet, the question gnawed at historians, forensic experts, and armchair sleuths alike. Who ate whom first, and under what unbearable circumstances? The public narrative was a theater of contradiction. London demanded news. The press invented stories, some heroic, some absurdly romanticized. One paper described Franklin as a martyred exploration, while letters from indigenous Inuit populations, later translated, spoke of ghostly ships, men staggering across ice like shadows, and a stench of death that lingered for miles. Conflicting accounts multiplied, each new discovery twisting the story further. Was Franklin still alive when the first men died? Did he survive the winter? Did his officers mutiny? Each theory seemed plausible and horrifying in equal measure. And then there are the artifacts, the cursed breadcrumbs of the past. Plates inscribed with names, compasses frozen in place, tin cans rusting but intact, journals written in half-legible ink with desperate doodles, scrawls, or cryptic notes, rations low. God help us. We march south. The ice laughs. It's like staring at a crime scene across 150 years. The ice has preserved evidence, yet simultaneously twisted it, erasing context, blurring chronology, turning rational deductions into guesses. What's more disturbing is the psychological thread running through every fragment. We can almost feel the men's minds fracturing as days blurred into weeks of white silence. One man writes of hearing voices in the wind. Another sketches faces on ice as though they were people. Another begins to hide small items, hoard them, or bury them in snow. You get the sense that the Arctic didn't just kill their bodies. It rewired their minds. Every detail we uncover deepens the impression that this isn't a simple disappearance. It's a slow-motion psychological unraveling, played out on a stage so hostile it could swallow every shred of rational thought. By the time rescue expeditions pieced together what remained, the narrative was already a labyrinth. Conflicting skeletons, half-eaten journals, Inuit oral histories, and erratic artifacts painted a tableau that defies clean explanation. And yet, we are compelled to stare, to try, to reconstruct, because somewhere in those frozen fragments lies the truth. Somewhere, the investigation begins with the usual Victorian flourish. Official commissions, endless letters, and the kind of bureaucratic optimism that makes you want to scream. Lord Stanley admired the officials, and a slew of naval officers dispatched search parties northward. These weren't amateurs. They were the finest men Britain could summon. Yet within weeks, the scope of their task became almost laughably impossible. Picture men hauling boats, sledges, and supplies across a frozen nothingness that seems infinite. Ice shifts, storms obliterate tracks, and and the northern wind carries no mercy. The evidence they collected was, at first glance, banal. Empty ships, abandoned sledges, clothing, utensils, skeletons. But these ordinary items turned sinister under scrutiny. One officer reported finding a man's boot filled with snow and sawdust, an Arctic coffin improvised out of practicality or desperation. Journals described frostbite, illness, and ration shortages, but hints of madness, mutiny, and cannibalism lurked between the lines. Investigators scratched their heads. How could an expedition so meticulously prepared succumb so utterly? Theories proliferated like weeds. Some blamed scurvy, which is plausible. Vitamin C deficiency was a known killer. Others suggested lead poisoning, thanks to the tinned food of the era, or even botulism from improperly preserved meals. Then there's the ice itself, the cruelest suspect. Ships crushed, routes blocked, men trapped with no hope of escape. Add the psychological toll, months of darkness, isolation, cold, and fear, and the Arctic becomes a predator as lethal as any disease. But the weirdest threads came from Inuit testimony. Decades later, Inuit recounted seeing strange men wandering the ice, half-naked, starving, speaking in tongues that made no sense. Some describe horrific cannibalistic acts. Others the eerie silence of shipwrecks visible only briefly through the drifting fog. These stories, once dismissed by British authorities as hearsay, later proved invaluable. The Inuit perspective gave faces to fragments, narratives to the skeletons, and added an unsettling truth. Survival had become a moral labyrinth, not merely a fight against the elements. Modern investigators have layered forensic science atop these historical clues. Analysis of bones confirms malnutrition, lead traces, cut marks indicating cannibalism. Reconstruction of the ship's journeys suggests navigational errors combined with unpredictable ice shifts. Satellite imagery and underwater exploration decades later revealed the Erebus and Terror, trapped in remote channels, still waiting under layers of sediment and ice, silent witnesses to the ultimate failure. What fascinates, chills, and frustrates most is that none of these theories are mutually exclusive. It was probably scurvy and lead poisoning and madness and ice and darkness all at once. Human arrogance collided with an indifferent environment, producing something almost mythical in scale. And the longer you study it, the more you realize the investigation isn't just about what killed them. It's about how multiple deaths, disasters, and human errors can intertwine into a story that feels impossibly coherent and yet maddeningly incomplete. The Franklin expedition, through its frozen remnants, has taught historians, scientists, and armchair detectives alike that the Arctic doesn't just end life. It distorts, amplifies, and immortalizes it. Every theory, every clue, every artifact is a piece of a puzzle that is simultaneously solvable and forever inscrutable. And that duality, between the knowable and the unknowable, is exactly what keeps the story alive, terrifying, and utterly compelling. And then it happens. The part where your stomach drops because what was already unbearable suddenly becomes grotesque. In 1859, 15 years after Franklin sailed into the Arctic, a skeleton is discovered on King William Island. But it's not just a body. It's a confession written in bone. A skull with missing teeth, cut marks on forearms and thighs. The men hadn't just died. They had eaten one another. And suddenly, the Victorian idea of orderly exploration, of gallant adventure, is revealed as a nightmare masquerading as history. Letters recovered by searchers tell a fragmentary story. Crews splitting, attempting to trek south to safety. Starvation driving morality into reverse. And Franklin himself? There's conflicting evidence. Some journals stop abruptly, leaving him a shadowy figure. Bones found nearby are inconclusive. Did he die a hero, frozen in his cabin, or did he stumble into the snow and perish amid his starving men? We can only imagine his last moments, a mixture of dignity, terror, and perhaps the horrifying realization that his expedition had turned into something grotesque and unrecognizable. The breakdown isn't just human, it's systematic. Ships meant to withstand ice, hulks of steel and wood, were crushed and buried under permafrost. Sledging parties with clear objectives became wandering, hallucinating shadows on the ice. Leadership fragmented. Every step southward was a march into chaos. And here's the cruel irony. The more organized they tried to be, the more the Arctic laughed. Orders, maps, and discipline. They were weapons that failed spectacularly against a world that required adaptation, improvisation, and luck. And don't forget the psychological collapse. Skeletons and diaries hint at men talking to the dead, leaving personal belongings in the snow as if to appease unseen forces. One sailor reportedly wrote in the margins of his journal about hearing voices calling him to the ice. You see, the breakdown wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, mental, and profoundly human. Desperation metastasized into horror, turning ordinary men into archetypes of suffering, madness, and moral erosion. Then the find became grotesquely specific. Skulls with fractures suggesting blunt force trauma, bones scored as if in ritual, artifact arranged unnaturally. The searchers themselves sometimes recoiled. They were uncovering more than death. They were confronting the raw, stripped-down anatomy of human collapse. And yet, even in this chaos, patterns emerge. A southward march, the gradual disappearance of groups, the occasional diary fragment screaming, "We cannot survive." It is almost too ordered in its horror, as if nature itself had choreographed this tragedy to maximize suffering and minimize understanding. This turning point shifts the story from mystery to something darker. The human capacity for endurance is finite. Pride, discipline, and technology falter in the face of raw elements and starvation. Authority erodes, morality contorts, and every subsequent discovery reinforces that the expedition did not simply fail. It disintegrated, piece by terrifying piece, until all that remained were fragments frozen in ice, like a museum of despair. So what do we actually know? What can we confidently declare about Franklin and his crew? The answer, frustratingly little, yet horrifyingly enough to keep you awake at night. We know Erebus and Terror were eventually located. Erebus in 2014, Terror in 2016, locked in icy tombs that no man could have opened without modern technology. We know skeletal remains tell tales of scurvy, starvation, and cannibalism. But beyond that, the narrative dissolves into ambiguity, speculation, and silence. Historians have attempted resolution, of course. One theory posits that poor provisioning, lead poisoning from tinned food, and Arctic winter darkness combined to destroy morale. Another theory leans heavily on the Inuit accounts of wandering, emaciated men scavenging the land. Some suggest a breakdown in command after Franklin's death, leading to disorganized southward treks and ultimate failure. And yet, each theory raises more questions than it answers. Did Franklin die on the ship or while trekking? Were there attempts at mutiny? Who exactly participated in cannibalism, and under what circumstances? Every answer seems provisional, haunted by what we'll never know. The official stance of the Admiralty at the time, ambiguous, polite, almost diplomatic, was to regard Franklin as a hero lost to heroic circumstances. In other words, they buried the tragedy in honorific language. But as modern researchers dug deeper, literally and metaphorically, the sanitized version of events crumbled. Ice and soil preserved a more honest, more grotesque story. And that story is horrifying not because it's neat or dramatic, but because it is relentlessly human. Ambition over confidence and survival instinct colliding in a frozen theater of cruelty. And then there are the lingering enigmas that defy both science and imagination. Some diary fragments suggest men heard voices or saw things no one else could see. Why did certain groups veer off course while others remained stationary? Were there last-ditch attempts to signal the outside world that failed, leaving only cryptic cairns and scattered relics? How much of the Arctic's wrath was natural, and how much of it was the result of human miscalculation? Every artifact, every bone, every frozen diary entry is a tantalizing but incomplete confession. The beauty and horror of this resolution, or rather non-resolution, is that it forces us to dwell in uncertainty. Unlike a crime solved or a mystery neatly concluded, Franklin's expedition leaves a perpetual itch in the mind, a gnawing insistence that we can never fully understand. There is closure, yes, but it is cold, distant, and unsatisfying, like the ice that claimed these men. We have outlines, sketches of horror, fragments of human suffering preserved by frost, but no totality, no final answer. It is a story of vanishing, of disappearance, of a slow-motion collapse so absolute that the line between nature's cruelty and human folly blurs. And it's in that blur that the expedition becomes timelessly haunting, a puzzle, a warning, and a record of humanity at the very edge of endurance. The aftermath is weirdly quiet for something so loud in its terror. Britain, initially consumed with heroism and prestige, slowly absorbed the horror and mystery like a bitter medicine. Families mourned, parades honored the lost, medals were struck. But beneath the pomp was an unspoken acknowledgement. Human ambition had met a force it could not negotiate, and civilization's best-laid plans had disintegrated like fragile snow under a sunless sky. The Franklin expedition's disappearance left ripples far beyond grief. Arctic exploration changed forever. Naval protocols, supply chains, and survival training were rewritten with one unyielding lesson. The ice does not bend. It absorbs mistakes, laziness, arrogance. Men learned that experience on temperate seas meant nothing here. The expedition, in its failure, became a case study in hubris, but also in resilience. The subsequent searches, spanning decades, inspired technological advances and mapped territories previously unknown, even if at enormous human cost. And culturally, Franklin's ghost haunts literature, folklore, and pop culture. Inuit oral histories preserved the reality long before Victorian England could admit it. Poets and novelists have seized on the story's eerie resonance. The silent Arctic, the ice-entombed ships, the journals half-chewed by rats or frost. It became emblematic of humanity's compulsion to conquer and the terrifying limits of that compulsion. Franklin, once a symbol of national pride, morphed into an archetype of tragic obsession, a cautionary tale against overconfidence. There are also psychological echoes, both in history and in modern research. Scientists analyzing the remains speak not only of malnutrition and disease, but of stress, paranoia, and mental unraveling. Anthropologists suggest that long-term isolation combined with extreme deprivation likely induced cognitive breakdown, hallucinations, and social collapse. The expedition didn't just fail logistically. It collapsed morally and psychologically. The legacy is a reminder of fragility, how finely tuned human coordination can unravel when confronted with environments beyond comprehension. Interestingly, the Franklin expedition has also influenced modern Arctic policy. Governments, explorers, and scientists now approach polar regions with extreme caution, respect, and contingency. Satellite monitoring, GPS navigation, insulated vessels, and strict rationing, all lessons inherited from tragedy. Every modern polar mission carries Franklin's ghost along its prow, a silent admonition, a frozen warning that arrogance in the face of nature's patience is deadly. And yet, for all the science, archaeology, and pop cultural mythos, the expedition remains haunting because it is unfinished. It is a story of absence as much as presence, men erased, stories fragmented, mysteries amplified. It teaches that sometimes the most powerful legacies are not in triumph, but in the questions left behind, the cautionary whispers that echo in the cold and the silent, patient Arctic that does not negotiate with ambition. And here's the part that lingers, the part that refuses to let you close the book or shut your mind off. Imagine standing on that frozen expanse, hundreds of years later, holding a fragment of a diary, a rusted tool, a human tooth still clinging to jawbone. The Arctic hasn't changed. The ice doesn't care. And somewhere in the silent snow, the echoes of Franklin and his men persist, not as heroes, not as statistics, but as human beings caught in a cosmic joke too vast to comprehend. There's a chilling absurdity to it. These were men trained to navigate, equipped to survive, celebrated as the embodiment of British ingenuity. And yet, every certainty they carried was irrelevant to the Arctic. The world they thought they controlled was an illusion. They became improvisational ghosts, drifting between life and death, their last thoughts probably mundane, petty, human, and yet catastrophically doomed. Somewhere in the remnants of Erebus and terror, somewhere in the teeth and bones preserved by permafrost, there's a message humanity struggles to decipher. Control is fragile, certainty is a myth, and even the most meticulous plans can dissolve under forces beyond reckoning. Perhaps that is the true horror of the Franklin expedition. It confronts us not just with death, but with our arrogance, our overconfidence, and our vulnerability. We like to think we conquer nature, but the ice remembers, waits, and ultimately judges with perfect indifference. And then there's a whisper in the wind, the line that survives through fragmented journals. God forgive me. Not a triumphant declaration, not a heroic last word, but a human plea. That plea reverberates across centuries because it is recognizable, intimate, horrifyingly close. It's the sound of pride meeting its limits, of ambition confronting reality, of humanity stripped to its core by the coldest, quietest executioner imaginable. History may have frozen the bodies, the diaries, and the ships, but it cannot freeze the lesson, the dread, the unshakable awareness that humans are fragile against forces we barely understand. The Franklin expedition isn't just a story of men lost at sea. It is a reflection, a mirror held to anyone who dares overreach, who assumes mastery over worlds larger than themselves. And as you think of them, stranded, starving, terrified, with nothing but ice and eternity for company, you can't help but feel watched. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.